discipline of anthropology in terms of its dealings with Africa in particular. And as I'll talk about this afternoon in my keynote, is just with diaspora studies, there's also a shift, an epistemological shift, I think, that forces us away from thinking about specific global questions around empire, and that leaves out Africa in particular ways. So there's that, and I wanted to. So these are not answers necessarily, but just just thoughts, because I don't have answers, and I think you guys are actually doing much better work than this original book. So there's that. I wanted to think about the Celina's question about the global north and the global south. Is that a useful place to think about critical race studies of Africa? And I think the best example I have actually is outside of Africa, thinking about Brazil. And because I do work in Haiti as well, Haiti has been under military occupation since 2004. And we don't talk about it because it's called the UN peacekeeping, right? But it's a military occupation that is run and headed by all the global south countries. And so Brazil was in charge of the military for 10 years of that occupation. And which is fascinating, right? So if you go to Haiti, if you look at the minister, the first 10 years, the head of the minister, the people who sit in the office were Europeans. The people who patrolled the streets were from all countries in the Caribbean and Africa. So this occupation of this country was being led by members of the Global South, because these people, the UN, that's how you pay your military, right? So if you're part of the UN project, you can pay your soldiers, but they're the ones that were patrolling Haiti. They still are, right? And which actually resulted in all these Haitians going to Brazil, which empire strikes back. So Brazil uses Haiti as a training ground for its own back then, for its own. It was trying to get on the Security Council, so it agreed with the U.S. occupation. So then it provided resources for that. So that, if you're thinking about that, and you're thinking about all the the hierarchies within the Global South, they actually replicate the other hierarchies, right? Where blackness, right, really remains at the bottom of the hierarchy, even within these Global South relationships. And that's blackness distinct from African cultural presence, because Brazil, as we know, can embrace Africa while killing more black people than the U.S., right? While the police kill more black people. So race and culture in Brazil are so different when it comes to Africa, which is really a fascinating thing. So I do think you can't necessarily not think about these global South dynamics, especially now with the Chinese soft power. But there's been Chinese killings of Ghanaians in the mines, the illegal mining, and so this is an emerging power where, with the militarization of the African continent, with the competition between China and the U.S., the African continent actually is embroiled in this, these political things that actually have a lot to do with race. And so then to go to your question about, is race the key, is race, what are the limits of the application of race in Africa? The point of the work was not to say race is the end-all and be-all of relationships on the African continent. It was saying that it was one relationship that wasn't talked about. Right. And so, and for me, that distinction matters. And it's not that we have to apply race and race relations to everything, but it's to acknowledge that there is a long history of race and empire that impacts, the local and the global, and how. And so that matters. But race, as Stuart Hall would say, for example, about class is the modality, race is the modality through which classes lived. We can say that about other things, because we have this long history of empire. And this empire is a racialized empire. And until we, and we have to acknowledge what Michelle Rolfe-Trio called the international hierarchy of races, nations, cultures, right? And so we have to engage with that. And within, if we understand that, this is like world systems theory plus race, right? If we understand that, then, we understand that it's there and we don't diminish it. And so the point was to actually just acknowledge that it's there when it wasn't being done. But I have to say, to end here, is to just, I'm really heartened by just the depth of, you know, the research and, you know, how it's really being carried forward. Thanks.
So the floor is open to questions from anyone, comments, feedback, thoughts.
And I think this question in part follows from the last panel too, which is with regards to the last comment, and Celina's point about the global south and the global north. I'm thinking of African Americans' relations to the continent at the precise moments where it provides political opportunities to not necessarily claim Africa in the frozen past, but Africa in the present. Yeah. And what made me think of that in part is when Malcolm X was talking about growing up and remembering that no one cared to think or talk about Africa until the moment of decolonization. And then all of a sudden every domestic black elite wanted to have an African friend that they could display to others, and that showed some form of sort of cultural capital that did not exist before. It even sort of could be played in counterparts to their white counterparts to show something. And also the fact that we know African American activism with regards to apartheid in South Africa also had its own sort of dialogue about what is going on here. So I'm just generally how a group that is within the global north is contextualizing the politics of the continent as a way to understand itself or engage politics of racism. What is the place of African Americans in this dialogue?
Well, I mean, there are multiple places, and depends on which group you're talking about. And the first Africanists were Black Americans in at least in the U.S. in black schools, HBCUs. And so if you think about Carter G. Woodson's An African Background outline written in 1910, or Du Bois's The Negro in 1915. So the first Africanists were actually black folks in HBCUs. And that's I'm giving my talk away, but they were displaced by, you know, U.S. State Department funding and the construction of African Study Centers outside of black institutions. And so they were displaced, and there's it's a physical displacement because then all the Africanists become white, right, at some point in the 60s. And so part of that is to think about their varying roles that living in empire, what it allows. It allows you to re-articulate empire's goals. It allows you to subvert it, and it's a shifting thing, and it depends. And I couldn't necessarily say that there's all, you know, the concern with Africa is all about these selfish things about making yourself better in the West, as much as it is responses to different moments of things. And so for example, if I think about state relationships, and so I described this moment when Nkrumah was trying to build a dam, the Volta Dam in Ghana, and the British had pulled out funding; they were broke, and Nkrumah's chief of staff was this African American who was, you know, traveling the South, traveling Virginia, was visiting, and was denied a room in a hotel in the South, and that became news all over, and became a diplomatic a terrible thing for the U.S., where you have this African diplomat, I forgot his name, African American diplomat working for his head of state, being denied housing because he was black. And the U.S. was so embarrassed that I think it was who was president? I remember, was it Kennedy? No, Johnson. One of the presidents, it's in the book, I forgot, but invited, so it was out of that actually Nkrumah got a discussion with the U.S. to get investment from the aluminum company, what's the name? Kaiser, to go in and invest in Volta Dam. So here you see an experience of racism in the South in the U.S. creates this diplomatic embarrassment, which then leads to a meeting where the U.S. president has to actually, you know, say, okay, we're gonna work with you, and we'll introduce you to these business corporations who then go back to Ghana and then and invest. I mean, badly, right? In the dam. And so, I mean, there are a lot of stories like that. And I think you're right. I mean, right now, U.S. empire is headed by blackface in these you know, Ghana has the 4th largest U.S. embassy in the world. Is it Ghana or Haiti? But you know, for a long time under Obama, it was black. Under Bush, you know, the ambassadors are black, and so you see, you know, the black face of empire in these places and doing the work of empire. Africana just was headed by a black man for a long time. I forgot his name. Kip. That was his name. Kip Ward. And so you have these relationships that come from being in the heart of empire, but it hasn't always been this one set of, you know, CIA agents. You know, Ghanaians used to be afraid of CIA agents in the 60s, in black, you know, these black CIA agents. But at the same time, you have Pan-Africanism, you have these other kinds of intellectual and cultural and political movements that counter that.
Just a quick note, I do remember engaging with the work by Prodigy Woodson or Du Bois, and they did engage race in ways that I don't see more contemporary scholarship.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll talk about this afternoon. There was a focus on imperialism that's completely really left out. I mean, but remember, African area studies is a result of empire. It's an imperial project, and so you're not going to deal with imperialism in particular ways. And so and so that's, you know, if we go back to Blyden and all these early people, they were doing the work. It just got completely displaced with the emergence of area studies as we know it.
Any other questions, thoughts, comments? That was a really rich banter just then.
I have a question for you, Osei. So you say you thought, what would Bob Marley say? What would Bob Marley say?
Well, I wouldn't
be surprised at that story. Yeah.
Yes. We don't know what Bob Marley would say, save for looking at sort of the record that he left behind in terms of the kinds of work that he did, in particular his interest in touring Africa extensively, which is the reason why reggae music has become such a huge force in Africa. And the reason why reggae music really became the soundtrack to the the apartheid movements, to the guerrilla movements for liberation of the southern countries that had dominant white settler populations in particular. So through that, one might argue that Bob Marley would say, or in the words of Fela, who I tried to son him here, this is all colonial mentality. So certainly I couldn't put words in his mouth, per se, but by looking at the record that he's left behind and the ways in which he attempted to engage Africa. He was one of the few artists, to this day there are reggae artists that really, still coming from Jamaica, still balk at the idea of going to Africa. Ironically, there's a huge star right now in the name of Luciano, who's probably the heir to one of the most spiritualist forms of roots reggae music, who has a very tenuous relationship with Ghanaians. On the one hand, being held up as a kind of international superstar committed to Africa in many ways, but at the same time making all kinds of comments about the weakness of Ghanaian reggae music, or not wanting to travel because of the Ebola scare, et cetera, et cetera. So you're right. I think that you're really right to question that a response from outside toward that question might be variable, depending on who you look at. For me, when thinking about folks like Marley and Tosh in particular, however, or Fela in particular, these are amongst those that I tend to look into their records and see, wow, they're very interesting statements, but also practice, particularly in the case of Marley. Tosh never had enough time. He too, like Lucky Dube, was murdered. Marley had the time and had an express interest in touring Africa heavily. He never did actually tour Ghana, but if Rita Marley, his wife's,
she lives there.
She lives there. She set up a home there. It formed a significant part of my dissertation work, thinking about the relationship between African diasporans, repatriation, as a central thrust of Rastafari and the ways in which it sort of engages the space of Africa, which has its problematics as well, because there's still romantic notions of an Africa, of a 15th and 16th century Africa, rather than an Africa that's in the throes of dealing with globalization and displacement of populations due to economics, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you're very right to ask the question, what would Marley say? We don't know exactly. What I would suggest that someone like Marley or a Fela or a Tosh would say would be that kind of statement, that if you go get up in the morning and you're going to church and you see a white man on the way, go back home because you've seen the face of God, that would be sort of roundly condemned. To what degree they might interrogate and analyze that is another thing. And this is the question about thinking about musical forms. They can be very emotive and they can allow you to, they're very inspiring, but they may struggle as compared to academics in some ways with being able to really tease out some of the conversations, right? So I think the question about what Marley might say is a good question mark, actually.
I have a question for you. I'm wondering what you think of Jonathan Glassman's work on kind of post-colonial independence movements in Zanzibar. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I found it a way, the limits. What are the limits of thinking about race? He thinks about the different ways that people are thinking about belonging and citizenship, and in which race is one of the ways that people might do so. And I found that to be a way in to talking about race, that it could be thinking about religion and kinship and other ways that people were marking difference and solidarity. But what's striking me from the discussion this morning is that what drops out of that then, kind of what you are bringing, kind of with a focus on race, that what is bringing is then this sense of the global hierarchy, of global white supremacy, that kind of drops out, perhaps because in order to trace out what are the implications of all those discourses and the ways that they overlap, then one doesn't go as deeply into them. So anyway, I just wondered whether you had thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think you answered your question. I think there's Jonathan Glassman. There's also this book just came out, Bruce Hall.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is this new trend of talking about race in these places that don't necessarily talk about white supremacy, right? So you can talk about racial difference as one aspect of identity formation, especially in East Africa. I just don't understand how you cannot not talk about white supremacy in places like Kenya, West Africa, because the relationship of even like Asians, and Africans on the East Coast are refracted through the colonial project, and then the idea of Islam, right? Race and Islam. So you have like this convergence of ideas of blackness and race, with the Arab occupation of Northern Africa, with European colonization. So you have the conversion of trans-Saharan slave trade, the construction of the North and South, a white Africa and a black Africa, which happens both in among the Arab idea of race and among Europeans, and so all those things are combined. And I think what more than race is the idea of white supremacy to me is a better way of thinking that, because if you start epistemologically with understanding that white supremacy is real and global, then your discussions about race will be impacted by that. And I think that's really, you answered it. That's what's, and I read Jonathan Glassman when I was writing the book, and it didn't do much for me in terms of trying to tease out what's happening. Because how do you explain, for example, the extreme Afrophobia in South Africa when your apartheid former masters are still there owning everything, but you don't see that kind of brutal response to that kind of foreign.
Exactly.
You don't. Whites are not attacked in the same way that Nigerians and Angolans and Mozambicans are. And so there's something there, and there's something about Africa, even like your thing about the binaries, right? The three of the binaries are still about African difference, which is really interesting to me, the New York versus the Senegalese. And there's a way that Africa then becomes really operationalized in ways to uphold white supremacy that I think is understudied.
We'll start here and then we'll go to you, Christian.
I was just a comment to you. You were mentioning Ghana. I had an opportunity to go to Ghana, and I was walking to a church, and when I seen this big picture of a white Jesus, I turned away and I said they should know better.
There is a black Jesus in Cape Coast, though.
Okay, I can't believe it. So I didn't go home. I just didn't go to
That's beautiful. I appreciate sharing that. Yeah, wonderful. Christiana?
Yeah, I'm thinking more, so I'm a first year doctoral student, and one thing that I struggle with is how to engage with the continent and intellectuals and institutions on the continent as we talk about some of these issues. Because sometimes it seems like I'm having these conversations, but what about the intellectuals on the continent and how are they talking about these issues? So I just was wondering if you guys could speak a little bit to your engagement with scholars on the continent, with students on the continent, and just in your different works, how you kind of navigate that and ensure that there is kind of this collaborative understanding as you're theorizing these issues.
I guess for me, so most of when I first started fieldwork, most of my interlocutors were actually graduate students at the University of Ghana, and you know, debates, conversations, reading groups. But I tell a story in the book about how I became conscious was through a group of Ghanaian students. I was on a bus, and I was there. You know, after undergrad, I did a year working for this fellowship, where they give you money, you just go hang out before grad school. And I met these guys who were part of the Pan-African, was it Sekou Touré's group? I forgot the name, All African People's Revolutionary Party. Right? So they invite me to these reading groups. And so these are like these young Ghanaians who are reading like Du Bois, The World in Africa, who are reading Malcolm X, who are reading Cabral. And so I spent an entire year actually learning about Pan-Africanism from these Ghanaians who were like college students and so on. So that is to say that the first time I got introduced to a lot of the texts are in Ghana, which we would never think of, right? And so that's an interesting thing. Having said that, it is true though. I think ideas of race don't, and I'll talk about this in the paper this afternoon, is that there's something that happens with post-colonial knowledge production, is that after colonization we think racial relationships end. And so there's hardly any work on racialization by Ghanaian scholars in Ghana. In fact, I was in Senegal, I saw you there. I was in Senegal a year and a half ago, and I was invited by a Senegalese scholar, Ibrahim Chow. And he wanted to do like one of the first conferences on race and blackness in Africa. So he invites me and I go there, and on the panel is this one guy from the Musée de l'Homme, this French guy, who sits there and basically does old school anthropology. It's like, you know, saying how you can tell a black person by measuring the nose. And no one is offended, right? So we're sitting there, and then so I give my talk, and everyone jumps at me, maybe because it's a gender pause, but they're just like, what do you mean there's no race in Senegal? And what are you talking about? You know, we don't, we don't have these problems, even as people are in the room talking about colorism and the hierarchies and so on. So it's been an interesting thing, and I think my engagement with African scholars are African scholars who are based in Europe and the U.S. And then as you know, scholars as opposed to like people on the ground in Ghana who really helped me formulate my ideas. But I do think that's an important question. I do think talking to scholars on the ground is important, and you're not gonna necessarily have agreements, but the engagement has always been there for me.
I just want to add that I feel like sometimes we have the same sort of mythologies about purity and authenticity when we think about African universities as well, right? Like, what are they saying about race? But they're from conversations that I've had with scholars on the continent, you know, they're caught up with the same. They're grappling with the same erasures and elisions of the history that imperialism carries out as we are here, right? We're also a very divided race scholarship, I guess, in the United States, and so there, a lot of times, at least in French West Africa, right, their interlocutors are folks in French universities, and all of what you can imagine the consequences of those dialogues
And
are.
funding.
And funding, so there's also, you know, very, that's the other thing I was going to say is right, when you're saying they're mostly based outside of the continent, right, there's a very serious economic reality of what you can and can't say also that's tied to publishing practices, right, when you're already on the margins of what is basically an American-centered academy globally, right. There was this joke at a conference at Aswad recently that was held in Spain of an Afro-Belgian scholar who said, oh, now all you Americans are exhausted because you had to travel all this way. Now you know how we always feel coming to your conferences, right? And we have to get up there and we have to perform when we've like come from, you know, the other side of the planet. And these are things we don't really think about when we're in the center of it. But I would also say, you know, just like any of our other political engagements, that citational practices are huge, and that's one of the ways that we can begin. But also, actually, the Africa Center here, I don't know if you remember Professor Alleyne, we had Paul Zeleza come
Yes.
a few years ago, great
Yes.
scholar, right?
Yeah.
And I remember reading a piece by him a couple years prior where he was sort of chiding American scholars who had this sort of dream of teaching an African university, which I admit at the time was a fantasy of mine. And he said, you know, they come in here and they take someone else's job, right? It's already hard enough to be in the professorate on the continent. They pay you more because you're doing this great sacrifice of you're an expat and you're like leaving the dream of the American Academy to come here. But then when he came to speak at the old Africa Center, may it rest well, maybe that's too contentious to talk about, the other building, former life, he was celebrating that, you know, and he said, I have all these programs in the works to try and get American scholars to at least do temporary residency on the continent, and mentioned, you know, a white woman scholar who had spent 2 years in Nigeria and was very proud of her work there. So I feel like it is a tricky issue both for here and there, but part of what we can do is to try and always do different collaborative things, and there's, you know, a lot of now innovative, I feel like, conferencing going on. AAA and ASA had the conference